You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is October 15th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. First, we want to announce that a new edition of Dr. Horne's book entitled Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, is available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Blows Against the Empire was originally published in 2008. This new edition of Blows Against the Empire includes a new introduction by Dr. Horne updating this classic text. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Lastly, this Friday, October 17th, from 6:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m., Dr. Horne will be at the Cultural Arts Center, Montgomery College, in Silver Spring, Maryland, for a book launch for his recent book, The Capital of Slavery, and a discussion about how the origins of D.C. echo today. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horne, first want to ask you about West Asia. Israel and the Palestinian resistance, led by Hamas, have taken toward ending the 2-year war and genocide against Palestinians that has devastated the Gaza Strip, with an exchange of hostages and detainees. The ceasefire has been largely holding, but in a sign of its fragility, yesterday, Tuesday, October 14th, at least 6 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces in northern and central Gaza, and the so-called Gaza Peace Summit being held in Egypt is similarly signaling that even harder work lies ahead. A last-minute plan by U.S. President Trump to invite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the multinational peace summit had to be aborted after the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said he would not attend if the invitation stood. The mid-air power struggle started after it was announced that the Israeli Prime Minister had accepted a late invitation from Trump to the conference, being jointly chaired by the U.S. President and his Egyptian counterpart, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, in Egypt. In addition, on October 11th, it was reported in the Washington Post that, according to leaked U.S. documents, Arab governments actually intensified their collaboration with Israel even as the IDF was carrying out genocide in Gaza. The documents established that their public denunciations of the carnage in Gaza were purely for show. Lastly, it was reported on October 10th that fighting between Hamas and one of the U.S.-Israeli-backed factions in Gaza, the Dugmush, left at least 27 people dead in Gaza City over the weekend. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of everything that has transpired and/or is transpiring in West Asia over the past week?
Well, first of all, the good news, because I'm afraid to say, as your introduction suggests, it is grandly outweighed by the bad news. The good news is that Netanyahu's stated ambition of liquidating Hamas, and in fact, de-radicalizing, his word, not mine, Gaza, that is to say, uprooting and exterminating anti-Zionist elements, has failed miserably. Second of all, and this we should not lose sight of, is the release of Palestinian prisoners, amongst which were a number of militants from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. With all due respect to Hamas, it seems to me that if we're going to move Palestinian statehood closer to reality, the PFLP and other such left-wing forces are going to have to play a starring role. And then, of course, there's the steadfastness of the civilian population, bombed to smithereens, hospitals destroyed, universities destroyed, daycare centers destroyed, but yet holding on despite open invitations to depart that land. But of course, they have not so fond memories of what occurred in 1947, 1948, when they departed what is now Israel, which they thought would be a temporary evacuation, a temporary sojourn. However, with regard to the bad news, when I was watching that tableau, that scenario in Egypt, with all of these leaders standing shoulder to shoulder behind Mr. Trump, I thought of the great novel by the Colombian Prize winner, speaking of Garcia Marquez, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. That is to say, when I saw that tableau, what instantly jumped into my mind was Chronicle of a Setback Foretold. That is to say, all of those individuals represented a certain kind of miserable history that has led us to the precipice of disaster. For example, some may wonder, why was the president of Indonesia, Prabowo, standing on this stage, given the fact that his nation is thousands of miles away from the point of conflict? Of course, Indonesia not only is the most sizable, predominantly Muslim and Islamic nation, but it's also because his presence in some ways represents in microcosm the tragedy that we are now facing today. Recall that we are marking in October 2025 the 60th anniversary of one of the most stunning and staggering setbacks against progressive movements in the 20th century, and in fact, in recent memory. I'm speaking of what happened on October 1st, 1965 in Indonesia, when the most powerful and influential communist party in the region, in fact, one of the most powerful and influential communist parties in the world, speaking of that of Indonesia, was liquidated, full stop. That is to say, up to perhaps 1 million people were killed in a matter of months. And we in the United States should pay careful and close attention to the reality that more than the army, which was in the vanguard of the coup against the popular President Sukarno, there were citizen militias who did a significant amount of damage, not unlike the Rwanda genocide of 1994, to come closer to home, not unlike what befell Native American groupings in North America in the 19th century, or, perish the thought, what may befall the progressive movement, I'm afraid to say, in the 21st century, if present trends continue. Not only that, there was a particular focus and targeting, I'm afraid to say, of Chinese Indonesians who play an influential role, not only in the economy, but on the left. And the massacres in Indonesia, in many ways, it was a signal to the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. That is to say, accept an anti-Soviet entente or face the prospect of liquidation. Of course, China opted for the former, but alas, as we shall talk about shortly, and as we have discussed repeatedly in recent weeks, that devil's bargain has backfired insofar as placed China in the passing lane. I also paid attention to President Erdogan, who, as was noted, was threatening not to attend because of the floating of the idea that the war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu might do so. When I saw Mr. Erdogan, I not only thought of the political opponents, particularly social democratic opponents that he has jailed and imprisoned, I thought of a late comrade of Paul Robeson, the great Black American intellectual and socialist. I'm speaking of Nazım Hikmet, a Turkish poet of the left who was jailed and tortured by the Turkish authorities, eventually passed away in Moscow in 1963. But in some ways, his fate and his destiny represents in microcosm why Mr. Erdogan was standing on that stage, because once again, the left was wounded severely, which has created an opening for the rise of leaders like Erdogan. And then, as what's noted, you see that as we speak, the Israelis are manipulating gangsters, oftentimes disguised as clans, who are anti-Hamas recall that a few months ago, one of the leaders of these gangster forces managed to get an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. That does not happen without high-level assistance. And of course, he has been assisted all along the way by Barry Weiss, a former New York Times opinion writer who started the pro-Zionist Free Press and now is heading CBS News because of a deal struck with David Ellison, who has just bought Paramount, which controls CBS News. This does not augur well. And all the while, as I was watching this scenario, I was thinking of our friends on the US left who have made quite a spectacle of denouncing what they call identity politics. Ew. At the same time, they don't have a mumbling word to say about the ultimate form of identity politics, which is Jewish identity politics, otherwise known as Zionism, which has led and contributed to one of the most significant genocides in recent memory. And of course, if we're not careful, could tip this entire planet into World War III. Now, going forward, it's apparent that Israel will either manufacture some sort of Hamas violation of this strange accord, which the warring parties apparently did not sign, and that will then lead to a resumption of the bombing, a resumption of the plundering, and that is not necessarily good news. But to return to where we began, that negativity might be outweighed by the positivity of the release of these prisoners, particularly prisoners from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to talk to you about the Nobel Peace Prize. On October 10th, Venezuelan opposition figure Maria Corina Machado was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, Machado is the smiling face of Washington's regime change machine, the polished spokesperson for sanctions, privatization, and foreign intervention dressed up as democracy. Machado's politics are steeped in violence. She has called for foreign intervention, even appealing directly to Benjamin Netanyahu, the architect of Gaza's annihilation, to help, quote, liberate Venezuela with bombs under the banner of, quote, freedom. Machado also demanded sanctions against Venezuelans, that not-so-silent form of warfare whose effects, as studies in The Lancet and other journals have shown, have killed more people than war, cutting off medicine, food, and energy to entire populations. Another suspicious fact related to Machado being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize was the Nobel Institute reported on October 11th that there was a leak that preceded the announcement of the Nobel Peace Prize, and that the leak was, quote, highly likely the result of espionage. In fact, the odds of Machado winning the prize jumped from 3.75% to nearly 73% overnight, Thursday to Friday, on the cryptocurrency-based predictive betting platform Polymarket. However, no expert or media outlet had mentioned her as being among the favorites for the prize, which was announced just a few hours later in Oslo. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Maria Corina Machado? What are your thoughts about the suspicious leak and the betting? Does Machado's being the victor of prize raise the likelihood of an invasion and/or coup in Venezuela? And it seems that over the course of history of the Nobel Peace Prize, it has become clearer and clearer that it is just another tool, if not an emblem, of U.S. imperialism. But is that an overstatement?
Not at all. I mean, we should have come to that conclusion when the man with blood on his hands, speaking of Henry Kissinger, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Recall that I think it was Tom Lehrer, the late satirist, who suggested that irony had died when Henry Kissinger received the Nobel Peace Prize, not to mention the fact that F.W. de Klerk, the last leader of apartheid South Africa, dragged reluctantly to the negotiating table because of the hammer blows inflicted by the anti-apartheid movement and the armed wing of the African National Congress. He too was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So the fact that there might have been profiting on these suspicious markets as a result of Machado winning this prize, I think is the ultimate commentary on the corruption of the committee that awards this prize. Obviously, they were trying to satisfy the voracious appetite of Mr. Trump, who has made no secret of the fact that since Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize somehow in 2009, that he should win this prize in 2025. His Secretary of State, speaking of Marco Rubio, might have gotten into hot water by congratulating Miss Machado for winning the prize. I'm not sure if that was pleasing to his supervisor. But the breaking news, according to the New York Times website, is that Mr. Trump has authorized covert action in Venezuela, which should come as no surprise, given the fact that Puerto Rico has become a staging ground for possible invasion, with 10,000 U.S. troops there, with 8 surface warships sailing throughout the Caribbean, with civilians on boats from Venezuela, executed without due process of law, challenging the very rudiments of international law, with nuclear submarines lurking offshore from Caracas. I have been suggesting in recent weeks that I had thought that the plan of Mr. Trump was to put so much external pressure on Venezuela with this staging of military force in the surrounding waters, that there would be internal cracking of the solidarity of the armed forces and that they would execute a military coup. But as noted, given the prominent role that our Cuban comrades play in Caracas, that has not happened, and in fact may not happen, which leads to the second supposition, that is to say that in some ways we may be watching unfold some sort of head fake where pressure is placed on Venezuela in order to lure Cuban troops and intelligence away from Havana, which could lead to an invasion of Marco Rubio's erstwhile homeland, speaking of socialist Cuba. In any case, U.S. plans for the hemisphere are encased in contradictions. Recall what happened just the other day with the visit to Washington of President Milei of Argentina, who is being accorded a massive multi-billion-dollar bailout at the same time that U.S. federal workers are being laid off, and at the same time that Argentine soybean farmers are selling soybeans to China, which has led to howls and peals of outrage from U.S. soybean farmers, who, of course, are seeing their markets go down the drain, that is to say, their markets in China. We should also recognize that Brazil could be an ultimate target of this show of force in South America, given the fact that it is the second largest country in the hemisphere, and that relations between President Lula and President Trump have not been ideal in recent weeks, not least because of the impeachment and threatened prison term of Mr. Trump's ally, speaking of former President Bolsonaro, who sought to launch a coup d'etat. But ultimately, the soft target that probably is in the crosshairs is the soft target right here at home. That is to say, to the extent that U.S. imperialism is circumscribed abroad, it will lead inevitably to attempts to wrench concessions from opponents here at home. Hence, we must pay careful and close attention, if not participate directly, in the No Kings protests from the Atlantic to the Pacific in the United States on Saturday, October 18th. In any case, we need a heightened manifestation of militant anti-fascism if we are to thwart the neo-fascists in Washington.
Mr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about the U.S. trade war against China. The U.S.-China trade war appears to be entering a new phase. As President Trump ramps up tariffs and port fees, Beijing hits back with rare earth restrictions and a probe into U.S. tech giant Qualcomm. Both countries are raising economic pressure, even as talks stall. Yet, Trump insists a deal is still possible, and a meeting with Xi Jinping is scheduled later this month in South Korea. Dr. Horne, what is your assessment of the latest phase of U.S.'s trade war against China? Firstly, it seems like the U.S. trade war against China would be more accurately described as one big self-inflicted wound or, better yet, a U.S. trade war against U.S. consumers. And lastly, Dr. Horne, does the trade war reflect a crisis of U.S. imperialism more broadly?
Oh, definitely 100% for sure. In fact, I would prefer to think that the current outbreak of this latest trade war between the United States and China may reflect a turning point in terms of the balance of forces and the correlation of forces globally between imperialism and those opposed to imperialism or those targeted by U.S. imperialism. Now, we should not get ahead of ourselves. I'm old enough to remember that in the 1970s, particularly in light of the success of progressive forces in Southwest Africa and Angola, led by the MPLA, who, with the assistance of Cuban troops and Soviet material support, were able to thwart a US CIA apartheid South Africa, and I'm afraid to say a Chinese attempt to put stooges led by the late Jonas Savimbi of UNITA in power. That was followed, as we well know, by the revolution in Nicaragua, the Islamic revolution in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and other particular turning points, or at least so we thought. But US imperialism had the ability to come from behind, and we should not rule out that possibility, as we indicated a few days ago when we suggested that if the Iron Lady, Takaichi, comes to power in Tokyo, that does not necessarily bode well for anti-imperialist forces, particularly given the historic ties between pro-nationalist, pro-capitalist forces in Tokyo and in New Delhi. However, on a brighter note, it's apparent that US imperialism is more dependent on China than vice versa. And that's not only in terms of the People's Bank in Beijing buying US Treasury bills, leading to this massive debt in the trillions that Washington owes to Beijing, but it's also reflected in China's attempt to circumscribe the export of rare earth minerals necessary for the production of war planes and of smartphones and of sophisticated automobiles, etc. It's not so much that these minerals are rare, it's that the processing is heavily centered in China, and that is a product of this heedless and reckless alliance that US imperialism brokered with Beijing on an anti-Soviet basis beginning in the early 1970s. In many ways, what we've seen in the past few days is the ultimate Trump taco. Trump always chickens out. That is to say, he comes out of the chutes with both guns blazing, then manages to pirouette and execute a retreat. For example, he's already looking forward to this meeting in Seoul, South Korea, with President Xi Jinping, and we can expect a walking back of some of these eye-watering tariffs, which he announced initially would be 100% packed or parked on top of the 30% announced a few months ago. And to take a telescope view of what's been going on in recent months, we can understand how we reached this point. That is to say, in mid-August 2025, there was the Alaska summit where literally the red carpet was rolled out for Mr. Putin. And as I interpret that event, Mr. Trump was making a last-ditch effort to woo Moscow into an anti-China cabal, a reverse Kissinger, if you like. That is to say, just like Kissinger was able to woo Beijing into an anti-Moscow cabal. Apparently, Mr. Putin and his comrades did not rise to the bait, and there followed a predictable stream of insults from Mr. Trump, terming Russia a paper tiger, threatening to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which could reach deeply into Russian territory and perhaps could trigger a World War III. But once again, what we need to pay attention to is the reality of U.S. imperialism losing altitude. And as it loses altitude, the possibility, if not probability, that it will seek to tighten the screws on us at home, perhaps is not coincidental that just today at the U.S. Supreme Court, it appears that the conservative majority is poised to overthrow one of the crown jewels of the anti-Jim Crow movement, speaking of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, among other things, will sharply reduce Black representation in Congress, progressive representation in Congress, strengthening the right-wing representation in Congress. Not to mention, just today, Mr. Trump announced that he is considering sending National Guard forces to San Francisco, perhaps the city in the United States that has the strongest progressive movement. And of course, you only have to beat one slave to keep the entire plantation in line. At least that was the motto and the mantra of the antebellum period. And it appears, at least, that Mr. Trump has in his crosshairs the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and battering and bludgeoning the city by the bay as a signal to the rest of us.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about another layer of the U.S. trade war against China, namely, the news that the EU plans to match President Trump's steel tariffs. In fact, it was reported last week that the EU's plans to match Trump's steel tariffs poses a, quote, severe and existential threat to the UK steel industry. While the move is allegedly intended to counter Chinese imports, with 80% of British exports going to the EU's decision to increase steel tariffs to 50% has the UK steel industry facing its largest crisis in history. Dr. Horne, speaking of self-inflicted wounds, the crisis of U.S. imperialism and the churning of the global order, what is your reaction to this news related to matching EU steel tariffs?
Well, we have to put this in the broader context being the checkered relationship between Brussels and Washington, between the European Union and the United States of America. On the one hand, as that sickening scenario in Egypt just the other day suggests, the European Union states oftentimes act as if they're vassals, as if they're schoolboys summoned by the schoolmaster, speaking of Mr. Trump, or Daddy, as Mark Rutte, the former leader of the Netherlands, once termed him. But on the other hand, if you look beneath the surface, you see that the European Union states, and in fact the European states, are trying to find substitutes for the United States as a trading partner. Witness the harried and scrambling negotiations between London and New Delhi. Obviously, the worm has turned since India was under British colonial rule for centuries. So now Prime Minister Starmer has to go to New Delhi with his begging bowl. And you also see this with regard to these negotiations, which are quite protracted, between Mercosur, the South American economies led by Brazil, and the European Union. There have been stumbling blocks to reaching a final pact, but I'm confident that ultimately that final pact will be reached because both parties have an interest in thwarting the ambitions and designs of U.S. imperialism. There is a spanner in the works, as they say in London. That is to say, the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of the French-German alliance, is under very severe strain right now because there is a desire as well to increase spending on armaments, not least so that Russia could be challenged more frontally. But there is an argument amongst the thieves. That is to say, the French thieves want the military spending to be centered in Paris. The German thieves want the military spending to be centered in Berlin. It's unclear how that will eventuate. And then there is the ultimate spanner in the works, which is that the European Union is not unified. That is to say, the US has many allies within the European Union, starting with Poland, which has suggested that it might name one of its major military encampments Fort Trump, of all things, not to mention the former Soviet Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which are firmly in the pocket of Uncle Sam. In fact, some of the leaders of these Baltic republics since the collapse of the Soviet Union actually came directly from Chicago or other US cities in order to lead these newly minted republics. This does not bode well. Also not boding well with regard to the European Union's fortunes is an article in the New York Times today which suggests that the Reform Party of Mr. Trump's comrade Nigel Farage in London is absorbing anti-choice elements, anti-reproductive rights for women elements, which does not bode well, and once again illustrates our theme for this evening, which is that as imperialism loses altitude, they will tighten the screws against their own populations, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.